So we all know about Nintendo versus Sega, but there was actually another competitor, NEC, and their console, the Turbografx 16. But you don't hear about this console all that much. So how did this thing compare to its competition, and why wasn't it as well received? Well, let's take a look. What's going on? It's Pojer, coming at you with another video. Alright, we're going to be talking about the Turbografx 16. That's a console I've been pretending doesn't exist. So if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. We just hit 10,000 subscribers. Thank you so much. Let's go further. And if you haven't already, join our Discord server. It's going to be at discord.pojer.net. I'll also put a link in the description. Anyway, let's talk about the Turbografx 16.
It's 4 times faster, so the games are more exciting. There are almost 10 times as many colors, so the arcade quality graphics are even more intense. And you can expand your
One of the first companies to support Nintendo was Hudson Soft. In Japan, they were the first third-party company to support the Famicom. Their earlier titles were very simplistic, with levels that were only one screen with very basic graphics. Some of Hudson's most popular games were Bomberman, Adventure Island, Lode Runner, and others. However, Hudson didn't only have a desire to make games, they also wanted to make hardware. But when Nintendo refused to buy their graphics chips, Hudson decided to work with someone else instead. Around this same time, the company NEC made numerous Japanese computers that were very successful. NEC wanted to join the video game market, but they didn't have a lot of video game knowledge. So as a result, Hudson and NEC joined forces and they would work on a new console. On October 30th, 1987, the PC Engine was released in Japan and it would be marketed as the first 16-bit console. This new console was initially a massive success in Japan. The unit was a lot smaller than the Famicom, which was unlike anything we had seen. But looks can be deceiving because despite its small form factor, it was more powerful than the Famicom and it had a strong lineup of games. The PC Engine actually got third-party support from companies like Konami and Namco, so we would get some excellent arcade ports. By looking at some of the games, you could tell its hardware was better than the NES. Its color palette was way bigger and it could handle more sprites on screen. These capabilities were especially nice for shooters. Normally, the NES would suffer from slowdowns and flickering from games like these, but the PC Engine could handle bigger sprites as well as more sprites on screen with ease. A lot of arcade ports that the PC Engine got were much better than what we got on the Famicom or NES. Gradius, for example, looked way more like the arcade version graphically, and it still retains the vertical scrolling, which was something that the NES version had to remove. Pac-Land, while the Famicom version was great for its time, the PC Engine one blows it out of the water. So it seems like things are going pretty well for NEC and Hudson. With the great success from their console so far, they decided to try releasing it in the US, but this is where they would start to run into problems. In order to attract the US audience, NEC didn't want to release the console as is, so they made some changes. They figured the US would prefer a bigger, more futuristic design, and they wanted to pick a name that represented the console better. So they went with a darker, slightly bigger design than its Japanese counterpart, and the console was renamed to the Turbografx 16. On August 28, 1989, the console would be officially released. Unlike Japan, NEC and Hudson ran into some issues, one of them being the pack-in game. So when you make a new console, you want to be very careful what game to include with all consoles. You want to give a good first impression, and you want to show off the console's capabilities. Remember, this is going to be the consumer's introduction to the console, so it better be a good one. On the NES, we got Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt. This was a revolutionary game with very large levels. There was nothing like this at the time, and it made for an excellent pack-in game. On the Genesis, Altered Beast was originally the pack-in game. Not the strongest title, but it features big sprites and parallax scrolling, which made the Genesis stick out from its competition. The Turbografx 16's pack-in game was Keith Courage. This is a very basic platformer that's divided into two parts. In the first part, you play as a slow-moving kid on a level that scrolls horizontally. In the second part, you have the Nova suit. Here, you can move much faster, and the levels now scroll in multiple directions, not just left and right. This is an okay game, but it doesn't show off the console's capabilities all that much. The graphics don't look much better than the NES, and the game is very repetitive. The levels all look the same, but with a different color palette. The Turbografx is capable of handling big sprites, but we don't see much of that here. They definitely made a mistake by making this the pack-in game. Even though Keith Courage was not a great introduction to the Turbografx 16, the console did have a lot to offer, so let's take a look at a few other games. Here's New Adventure Island. Here you play as Master Higgins, who must complete the level while staying well fed. You start out defenseless, but you can collect various weapons throughout the game. This is basically a better version of the NES one with superior graphics and more features. The developers tried to get around the lack of parallax scrolling by using sprites as the background and using single-layer parallax scrolling. We can definitely see the Turbografx 16's capabilities a little better here with large background sprites and a large color palette. The music is also excellent. Overall, this is a great game, and I'm glad they brought this franchise to the console. Now for Bonk's Adventure. You play as Bonk, who is actually the mascot for the console. You can use your head as a weapon, and also glide in the air by repeatedly turning your head. Throughout the game, there's meat that you can grab that will give you special abilities. The mechanics take some getting used to. You can't simply jump on enemies to kill them, you have to face your head downwards in order to actually get the hit. On the other hand, you can actually hit enemies above you if your head is facing the right way. A few times I was facing the wrong way and took damage when I didn't mean to. It's not like Mario where you can just jump on top of them without thinking about it. I'm not a big fan of the graphic style, honestly it looks more like an NES game. Although to be fair, there are some big sprites, and they did use background sprites for parallax scrolling on some stages. With that said, this is a decent game, much better than Keith Courage. It's insane that they made that game the pack-in title and not this one. Here's Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu. It's a silly platformer where you play a bobblehead-looking Jackie Chan. Your regular abilities are limited, just jumping, punching, and kicking, but you can collect icons that give you temporary special moves. I thought this would be a fighting game since it's Jackie Chan, but I'm glad they went the platforming route. This game was also released on the NES, but this version is much better. On some stages, we see some single-layer parallax scrolling, which is a nice touch. The game uses big sprites, and the graphics are colorful, so we really see the power of the Turbografx here. The music is also fantastic. This is one of my favorite games on the console, if not my favorite. Here's a few other games that are worth mentioning. Magical Chase, which is the rarest and most expensive Turbografx title, is a nice cute-em-up with very colorful graphics and nice parallax scrolling. This could pass as a Super Nintendo game. Alien Crush is one of the best pinball games on the console, and it has very colorful graphics. Blazing Laser is a decent shooter with colorful graphics, parallax scrolling using sprites, and many weapon upgrades to pick from. The NES normally had trouble handling shooters like these because of all the sprites on screen, but this was no problem for the Turbografx 16. Street Fighter II was ported to this console as well, and it came out insanely well. This looks like the Genesis version. I'm honestly really impressed with this. It really shows the Turbografx 16's true potential. So yeah, Keith Courage being the pack-in game was a very interesting decision when there's a lot of other games that show off the console's capabilities and their great titles. But this wasn't the only problem with the console. Even though the Turbografx 16 was technologically superior to the NES, the Genesis came out a few weeks before it. and this console could handle bigger sprites and support 2 background layers. The Genesis could do everything that the Turbografx could, and more, and that's weird because it's technically the older console. To be fair though, the Turbografx's launch was delayed because of how much time NEC and Hudson spent on Americanizing the console. Had they released the PC engine in the US without changing anything, it would have come out sooner than the Genesis. Not only was the Genesis better hardware-wise, but the Turbografx hardware was not quite cutting it. The console's inability to parallax scroll really hurt it because it made the games look much weaker than ones on other 16-bit consoles. To get around this limitation, game developers utilized creative tricks to give the illusion of parallax scrolling. For example, in Ninja Spirit, animated tiles were used, which legitimately looks like a second background layer. But the flaw with this method is that you have to use the same tile over and over again, so you don't get a lot of detail. It almost looks like the tile of a baby's room. The NES was actually capable of this tactic as well, and we saw it in games like Micro Machines. Like I mentioned with some of the games, single-layer parallax scrolling was used here and there. This is when you take the same background layer and have them scroll at 2 different speeds. The problem here is that you can't put any blocks in the parallax scrolling layer, so you have to leave the top of the level completely empty. This might make the game look better graphically, but from a game design perspective, it limits you on where you can place blocks on screen. So really, it's up to the developers on whether they want to sacrifice the level design for better graphics. The NES was also capable of single-layer parallax scrolling, and numerous games utilized this. And finally, some games used background sprites as a method of parallax scrolling. This is nice because you don't need to waste a part of the one and only background layer that the console has. But the drawback is, like all sprites, too many of them on screen at once causes flickering. And do you really want flickering because of the background? But to be fair, the Turbografx 16 was great at handling lots of big sprites on screen, so this was almost never a big deal. The NES almost never utilized this tactic because even more than 2 or 3 sprites on screen might cause flickering. Imagine if the background had sprites. Game developers had to utilize these tricks to stay relevant against the competition. Without parallax scrolling, a lot of the games make the Turbografx 16 look like nothing more than a beefed up NES. As a console that's trying to compete with the Genesis and later on the Super Nintendo, this is not a good look. Speaking of hardware, it's debatable whether the Turbografx 16 is actually a 16-bit console or not. While it does have a 16-bit graphical processing unit, it uses an 8-bit CPU. So it's really up in the air whether this should be considered an 8-bit console or a 16-bit one. In Japan, the PC Engine was a big success, even becoming the best-selling console at one point. In the US, however, the Turbografx 16 could not find the same footing. Despite that though, the console has a massive following. It has a great lineup of games, and it's one of the most sought-after consoles by collectors. Numerous Turbografx 16 games would be re-released on platforms like Virtual Console, and the Turbografx 16 Mini was released in 2020, which features mini games. So clearly, there's still a lot of demand for this console. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.